for you lucky people, because tonight is the night. I don't know why everyone has been absolutely dreading this talk when we're going to go through all the kings of Israel and Judah. I mean, perhaps it's a bit reminiscent, perhaps, of the sort of stuff that you used to do at school. I don't know, but I think it will pay dividends, if only to, sort of give us just a kind of, to lodge in our brains that the extent of the history that we've covered so far, remembering that this first phase of the Bible is the history fundamentally of Israel in the land, or Israel coming into being and then Israel going into the land. And so, it's good for us to, to kind of lodge this very much in our brains. And so a kind of a recap really on the, the sort of like the history covered by 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles. I even at this moment see people unrolling sleeping bags and winding up alarm clocks. Crumbs. Honestly, what an unacademic lot. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Anyway, let us remind ourselves of where we've thus far come. We've seen Israel as a nation come into being through Abraham. We saw Abraham become a nation. We saw this nation end up in Egypt and then becoming as a nation slaves in Egypt. We saw them for, sort of like, 200-300 years in that condition, and eventually God raised up Moses, who led them out of Egypt. And he led them out of Egypt in order to ultimately take them into Canaan. We saw the 40 years of the wandering in the wilderness, and then we saw Moses dying and being taken over as the leader of Israel by Joshua, who then led them into the land, and they went in there and they beat the Canaanites up and they established themselves in the land. Them having done that, we saw the 300 years that covered really the rule of the judges, the first 300 years of Israel being in the land. And we saw basically again and again and again the pattern that when there was leadership that was godly, the people were godly. When there was leadership that wasn't, the people weren't. So if you had leadership, things seemed to go okay if that leadership was godly. But the moment that leadership failed, then anarchy, kind of spiritual anarchy, broke out. And that was really the story of the judges. And eventually, the Lord, the people said, well, look, let's have kings. Let's have a monarchy like all the nations round about. And of course, the Lord didn't want that. That was never really his plan. He was their king, and he wanted to rule them through prophets. I mean, the judges really were prophets, and through people like Samuel. That was really what God wanted, direct leadership from himself via the prophets. And but the people turned their back on it, and they said, no, we want a king. And you remember that the Lord said to them, okay, right, you can have a king. He said, but to a certain extent, you're going to regret it. Once I give you kings, it's no use coming to me about it. You're asking for kings, I'm giving you kings. And of course, in the history of the kings, by and large, that we've seen, and that we're going to just go over again very quickly tonight, we'll certainly see that the people did regret ever asking for kings. Because although 1 or 2 of them were okay, the vast majority certainly weren't, as you'll see tonight. And you'll remember that the very first king was King Saul, and he was very much a kind of an omen of what was to come, because he was eventually laid aside and rejected by God because he was so rebellious. And but then he was replaced by King David, and under King David you'll remember that Israel hit the peak of its splendour. I mean, Israel to this day has never got back to the glories of the reign of David, when there was to a greater extent through David and Solomon, a greater extent than ever before, Israel was living at peace in the land, and the blessings and the prosperity of the Lord were upon them. And we saw, the reign of David, and then eventually Solomon took over. And it was really when Solomon took over that there was really that peace and that absolute peak of glory of Israel as a nation in the land, when all the nations kind of were paying homage to them. But then we saw that King Solomon, after a while, and because of marrying so many wives, or not just the number of wives, but the fact that he married outside of the faith, and eventually he was corrupted. And the great enemy of Israel was always idolatry. The first commandment was always none before the Lord, and idolatry was always the enemy of Israel. And that Solomon was corrupted, and he went into idolatry through the influence of his wives. And you'll remember that as a judgment on him, because of that, he was told that the kingdom was actually going to be torn from him, or 10 of the tribes were going to be torn from him, and that the kingdom would divide. And he was told that the leader of this new kingdom that was going to emerge would in actual fact be a friend of his, a friend of Solomon's, a guy called Jeroboam, you remember, who he saw was actually in charge of Solomon's labour force. He was a real right-hand man of Solomon, and that he was told that he was going to lead this new confederation of tribes that was going to come into being. And as a result of that, Solomon tried to kill him, but Jeroboam escaped. And of course, what happened was that Jeroboam ultimately led what was to be the beginning of this divided kingdom, when the nation of Israel in the land divided into the northern and the southern kingdoms. There were the 10 tribes that broke away, the northern kingdom, Israel, and then there was the messianic line, the successors of David and Solomon, the tribe of Judah in the south. And what we're going to do is we're just going to whip through all the kings in chronological order, all right, and we're going to start with the kings of Israel. So this was the breakaway nation, all right. Now then, you'll remember that what happened when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over the throne. Now he was a bit of a twit, and you'll remember that we saw that Jeroboam, who was the one who was prophetically anointed to lead this breakaway kingdom, Jeroboam, what he did is that he went to Rehoboam and on behalf of the people asked Rehoboam if they could have a slightly less strict and austere regime than they were sort of given with his father Solomon. And you'll remember it was because of Rehoboam's rather stupid responses, which we'll see when we come on to do the kings of Judah shortly, that eventually the people totally rebelled against him, and the 10 tribes went with Jeroboam. They made him their king, and so the northern kingdom, Israel, split off from the southern kingdom, from then known as Judah, and the divided kingdom came into being. So Jeroboam was the first king of the breakaway kingdom, and you'll remember he was appointed on the prophetic word of the prophet Ahijah, and but of course it doesn't necessarily mean that he was a good king. Just because he was God's choice for this breakaway, it was still a breakaway. And what we're going to do for every king, we're going to see what the verdict of the scriptures on them. And the verdict of the Bible on Jeroboam was this: the Lord said to him, "You have done more evil than all who lived before you." So he was not a good king, and he set the stage for what was to happen, for what was to follow in the history of Israel, the northern kingdom. And you remember that what he did is he set up his own golden calf religion, and he had a main altar up in the north, had been up near Cromer, and he had another one down in the south on the border with Judah, which we saw was around Bedford and sort of like St Albans, and no, St Albans, not Bedford, and he set up this new faith that he concocted. So he was an idolater, and you'll remember that God sent a prophet from Judah to rebuke him while he was doing one of the sacrifices on this altar that he'd made. And you'll remember that he raised his hand so that his soldiers would grab the prophet and presumably kill him. But as he raised his hand became leprous. And it was only when he started being nice to the prophet that his hand was restored and that he was healthy again. So it's a lesson there: be nice to prophets. It's certainly in your own interest to be so. And anyone who thinks they're a prophet, form a queue. And you'll remember that his son Abijah died as a judgment, so God's judgment really came on him. And Ahijah, who was the prophet who anointed him, went to him and told him that his family all his descendants were going to be cut off by the Lord. So a really disastrous king number one for Israel. And he reigned for 22 years. So that was how long he was king. And he died a natural death, and he was then succeeded by his son, who was called Nadab. Now, Nadab reigned for 2 years, so he didn't last too long. The Bible's verdict on him: he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And after 2 years, he was assassinated by a bloke called Baasha. And so Baasha assassinated him and took over, became the next king. But in the process, killed off all his family. So therefore, the prophecy of Ahijah, that Jeroboam would have all his descendants cut off, was fulfilled. Because Nadab, his son, was assassinated by Baasha, and Baasha then proceeded to kill his whole family. So Nadab lasted for 2 years. Right, so king number 3 in Israel, Baasha. And Bible's verdict: he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And the prophet Jehu prophesied that all his descendants would be cut off as well. So we see God's judgment against him. He was the means of God's judgment against Jeroboam and Nadab, but is now himself going to come under God's judgment. And he reigned for 24 years, and he died a natural death. And when he died, he was succeeded by his son, king number 4, Elah. Now of Elah, the Lord said that he provoked the Lord with his worthless idols. So again, an idolatrous king. This ran through the whole of the history of the northern kingdom that broke away. And he reigned for 2 years. And after 2 years, he was drunk, got drunk one day, and whilst he was drunk, he was assassinated by a bloke called Zimri. So Zimri now becomes king. But in so doing, Zimri didn't just assassinate Elah, he killed his whole family, wiped out all his living family. And therefore, the prophecy of Jehu against Baasha and his descendants is therefore carried out. So we've seen Jeroboam and Nadab, that family line wiped out because of God's judgment. Now we've seen Baasha and his son Eli, his whole family line wiped out. So already 4 kings but 2 dynasties. This is not continuity in any sense of the word. It's really up and down all over the place. Anyway, so now we have Zimri as king. And having killed Elah and all his family, Zimri takes over as king. And the scripture's verdict: he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he, as if trying to set a record, lasted for 7 days. He was king for a week. And after a week, the army decided that they didn't want Zimri to be king. I mean, they didn't want Elah to be king. They were quite happy that Zimri had assassinated Elah, but they didn't like Zimri. So what they decided to do was that they proclaimed their commander-in-chief as king. So the army, their commander was a bloke called Omri, and so they now proclaim him as king. So they say, no, we don't want you to be king, Zimri. We're going to have Omri. He's going to be king, our commander-in-chief. Now then, in a situation like that, when the head of the army is proclaimed king by the army, and you find yourself king for just 7 days without the army on your side, you are in trouble. In fact, more than that, you're in big trouble. So Zimri, realising the big trouble he was in, and presumably not wanting to actually go through the indignity of actually being assassinated by the army or Omri in the same way that he'd assassinated Elah, he vanished into his palace and set fire to it and committed suicide. So that was his end. So now Omri, right, the commander of the army, blah blah blah, he is now king. But the moment that he's become king, Zimri having committed suicide, and so the moment Omri becomes king, there's a threat to his kingship because another bloke called Tibni, who had the support of the people, now put himself forward to be king. So the army have put Omri, their commander, as king, but now the people decide that they want Tibni to be king. So there's a kind of intrigue and stuff like that, but of course the army tends to usually be more powerful than the people, and it's Tibni who is killed. So Tibni, although he made a play for the throne at this point, never actually became king. So Omri won out on that occasion. And he stayed in power for 12 years. He died a natural death, but the Lord's verdict on him is that he did evil in the sight of the Lord and sinned more than all those who were before him. So you see that the evil, the rebellion, is becoming greater and greater. It's not just that the leadership here is bad, it's getting worse and worse and worse. So Omri dies, and he's succeeded by his son Ahab. Now Ahab has got to be one king that you know all about, because of course we did the Elijah series, didn't we? Ahab, he reigned for 22 years. Now remember, we've just seen that his dad Omri, the Lord said of him that he's done more evil than all those who went before him. But of Ahab, the Lord said he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So can you see it's getting worse and worse? Each king is worse than the one they're replacing. And you'll remember that with Ahab, because idolatry was already in place in the north because of this calf worship that Jeroboam had introduced from the word go, but Ahab now married Jezebel. Jezebel coming from Zidon, which was the centre of Baal worship, and she was a high priest in the cult of Baal, a high priestess rather, and like her father, the king of Zidon, was kind of like the world leader of Baal worship at the time, and Ahab marries her, and as a result of this, Baal worship now comes into Israel. Perhaps the most grotesque form of idolatry that Israel had thus far in its history experienced. And of course you'll remember that the Lord raised Elijah up, and Ahab crossed swords with Elijah, and as a result of that ministry all the prophets of Baal were put to death. There was the contest on Mount Carmel, and Baal worship was certainly set back to a very large degree because of the ministry of Elijah. And you'll remember also with Ahab that he got into an alliance with Jehoshaphat down in Judah at the time that Ahab was reigning up in Israel. Old Jehoshaphat was reigning down in Judah, and although, as we're going to see, Jehoshaphat was a good king, he got into all these sort of silly alliances, and Ahab went into alliance with Jehoshaphat against Aram, to get Ramoth Gilead back that had been nicked by Aram, which was Syria. Well, that's what Syria was called then. And you'll remember also that there's that marvellous story about the prophet Micaiah that Ahab kept locked up in the dungeons because he never prophesied well for him. And and Jehoshaphat, sort of says, well, look, before we go into this battle together, are there any more prophets? And Ahab said, well, there's old Micaiah down in the dungeons. And Jehoshaphat, said, why is he there? And of course Ahab said, well, he never prophesies the right thing. And of course Micaiah is brought before them and prophesies that Ahab is going to be killed and blah blah blah, which of course happened that very day in the battle to get Ramoth Gilead back. And so there Ahab dies, and of course through the ministry of Elijah and Elisha as well, it's declared that his dynasty was going to be completely cut off. So eventually all his family and descendants would be killed. And you'll remember there'd be the prophecy that that Jezebel, that her body would lie in the streets and be eaten by the dogs, and there wouldn't be anything left to bury. All jolly good stuff. And so Ahab dies in that battle, and then he's succeeded by his son Ahaziah. Ahab lasted for 22 years, and now his son Ahaziah takes over. Now then, Ahaziah, true to form, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he reigned for 2 years. He got into an alliance with old Jehoshaphat as well. So Jehoshaphat, you'd have thought he'd learned his lesson from Ahab, but he didn't. Now he goes into alliance with his son. You'll remember that he's the one who fell through the ceiling, and as a result of that sent emissaries to get occult healing for him. And you'll remember that as his men were going on their way, Elijah intercepted them, and do you remember they were sort of like rude to him, and he called fire down from heaven until the third lot of soldiers got a hang of it and started to say please. And once they started to say please, Elijah actually went to see Ahaziah and told him he was going to die, which he duly did. and because he had no sons, and therefore he was succeeded by his younger brother, who was called Joram. So you had Ahab, the real naughty baddie, all right, and of his two sons, Ahaziah took over from him, and then his other son, Joram, took over from Ahaziah when Ahaziah died. So Joram, again, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He reigned for 12 years and got into alliance with Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat worked his way through all of Ahab's family, getting into alliance with them. You'll remember the incident where, as a result of the Moabites attacking, the alliance, Jehoshaphat went into alliance with Joram, and Elisha, who had by that time taken over from Elijah, you remember that he said to them, well, look, the Lord is going to bless this battle, but only because Jehoshaphat's in it. If it was just you, Joram, God wouldn't give you victory, but because Jehoshaphat's in this alliance and he's right with God, God will give you victory. And there was that incident where the armies coming against them were, really big armies, but what they did, Elisha's word, is they dug all these ditches because they needed water, and then the ditches filled up with water, which sort of saved their lives. And then the next morning, the army that they were due to fight looked at all these ditches, and the sun came off the water in the ditches in such a way that it looked like the ditches were full of blood. And so the enemy decided that Israel and Judah, that their two armies had ended up fighting each other and they'd slaughtered each other. Therefore the enemy army went down thinking that the battle was already run, and then of course Jehoshaphat and Joram's armies completely marmalised them, and so God gave them victory. That was Joram, and Elisha helped him a lot. And later on there was a battle with the Philistines when the Philistines kept invading, and every time they invaded, Elisha went to Joram and told them where the Philistines were going to attack, and so Joram had his army there. And eventually the Philistines thought, well, we've got to get Elisha. And you remember the Philistine generals said to their king, look, we haven't got a spy in the camp, but Elisha is telling Israel's king what you say in your bedchamber. So that was the connection. Remember, they went out to get Elisha, and they came to the city where he was staying. You remember Elisha's servant got up one morning and the Philistine army completely surrounding this town, and he sort of like freaks out. And Elisha just says, Lord, open his eyes. And then he looks again and he sees the angels of the Lord surrounding the Philistine army. And then the Philistine army is struck blind, and Elisha then leads them to Samaria, where they're held captive for a few days, given a cup of tea and sent home. And that was all during the reign of Joram. So God blessed him, but not because he was faithful, but just because God was just blessing his people. He didn't want Israel to be wiped out at this particular point. And it was also in the reign of Joram when the Aramites, under the kingship of Hazael, attacked again and laid siege to Samaria, even to the point when cannibalism broke out. And again, that was the ministry of Elisha, helping King Joram. And then eventually he ended up in alliance with Jehoshaphat's grandson down in Judah. So it sort of like ran a bit in Jehoshaphat's family, this alliance with wrong people. But eventually Joram was assassinated by a guy called Jehu. And God had raised Jehu up under the ministry of Elijah and Elisha to be the means of carrying out God's judgment on the family of Ahab. So now Jahab kills Joram and the rest of Ahab's family, so that dynasty is wiped out, as Elijah and Elisha had prophesied that it would be. And you'll remember eventually when Jehu came to get Jezebel, the last remaining member of the family, her eunuchs threw her out of the window, and so she died when she hit the ground, and her body was just left there, and the dogs licked her blood and ate the body, just as Elijah had prophesied all those years earlier to Ahab. So now Ahab's family, yet another dynasty. You see, in Israel, each dynasty ended up being wiped out completely. There was no continuity at all. You had this family got a couple of generations in, wiped out. That family got a couple of generations, wiped out. You see how it's working, God's judgment on them the whole time because of their continued idolatry. So now we come to Jehu. Remember, he'd wiped out Joram and all Ahab's family, and Jehu, appointed by the Lord to do this. And he reigned for 28 years. And he followed the Lord a bit. He was actually the only king of Israel who followed the Lord in any way at all. But he followed the Lord a little bit. And what the Bible says of him is that he was not careful to keep the law of the Lord with his whole heart. So Jehu was a little bit for the Lord, but not completely. He completely rid Israel of all remaining influences of the Baal cult. So he at least did that. But having done that, he still kept the golden calf thing going. You know, so this false religion that Jeroboam set up when he became king, he kept that going. So he was, to a certain extent, knocked some idolatry on the head, the worst of it, but this kind of this vein of idolatry with the golden calf that ran all the way through Israel's history, he kept that. So he was what you would call a carnal believer, old Jehu. He wasn't a total pagan like all the others, but neither was he wholeheartedly from the Lord. He was a believer. He followed the Lord, but a bit where it suited him, and that was all. And as I said earlier, he reigned for 28 years. He died a natural death. And when he died, he was succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. Now, Jehoahaz lasted for 17 years, so that's not a bad innings, really, as far as the kings of Israel go. But he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He sought the Lord once. There's one occasion when he prayed and asked the Lord for help. And he prayed and he asked the Lord for help when Aram, invaded. Syria invaded all the time, and they invaded, and on one occasion he sought the Lord and asked the Lord to deliver him, not because he was a believer, but because he didn't want to be killed and he didn't want to be taken over, he didn't want to be invaded. And he asked the Lord and the Lord helped him, but he didn't become a believer, he used the Lord. And so that was that. And after reigning for 17 years he died, and he was succeeded by his son, who was called Jehoash. And Jehoash, he reigned for 16 years, so 1 year less than his father managed. And would you believe he did evil in the sight of the Lord, unquote. Now, Elisha is still going strong. All right, Elijah obviously is long dead, but Elisha, now a very old man, but is still going strong. And Jehoash was at least influenced here and there by Elisha. They were friends. They knew each other. They were reasonably close. And it was during Jehoash's reign that Elisha died. So Elisha was kind of reasonably friendly with Jehoash. And but again, he didn't give up idolatry. He didn't do anything to try and stop idolatry. So even though he was close to Elisha, and even though he knew the Lord was there, he kept on in idolatry. And you'll remember there was the incident of the striking the ground 3 times with the arrows. And as a result of doing that, Elisha said, well, look, you're going to have 3 victories over Syria. But he said, however, if you struck the ground a bit more, you'd have got total victory. What he was saying, look, if you'd have expected a bit more from the Lord, you'd have got a lot more from the Lord, but you only expected a little bit, so that's all you're going to get. A little bit of according to your faith be it unto you there. And the other thing of note about Jehoash is that he warred with Amaziah, who was at that time reigning in Judah, but that was because Amaziah kept invading him. So Jehoash didn't want to fight Judah, but Judah at that point kept fighting him. So there were skirmishes with Judah, and he eventually died natural death, and he was succeeded by his son, whom was called Jeroboam. And because the first king of Israel was Jeroboam, obviously he becomes known therefore as Jeroboam the second. So now we got Jeroboam 2. Now if his dad and granddad had both sought the Lord a little bit, even though it was only to suit them, them using the Lord, old Jeroboam the second, no seeking the Lord at all. I mean, back to total pagan now. and he reigned for 41 years. And as a result of the proclamations of Jonah, the old prophet Jonah, who wasn't just an evangelist to the Ninevites, although when we come to do the book of Jonah, we'll see that the book of Jonah was about his evangelistic exploits, but Jonah was also a prophet to Israel, and under his ministry, all the treasures and wealth that Hazael of Syria had, taken from Israel because of all his invasions were kind of, restored back to Israel. So, therefore, as a result of that, Jeroboam II, because of the ministry of Jonah, got back some of the goodies that Aram had nicked from Israel, through various invasions and that. And then he died a natural death, and he was succeeded by his son Zechariah. Now, can you see that this little dynasty here, because Daddy and Granddaddy sought the Lord only a tiny little bit, we're on to the 4th generation now, so they're lasting, you see. I mean, God's judgment is on them, but it's not as decisive as it was. So even though there was only a really minimal seeking the Lord, and even though it was a totally selfish seeking the Lord, nevertheless, this dynasty, this family, got more of its members on the throne than any other. So you just see that, the Lord, the slightest excuse, and the Lord will bless. But that's grace. So, anyway, he dies and succeeded by his son Zechariah. And Zechariah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, on this dynasty, although it's lasted longer than any of the others, all right, now the blessing's running out, all right, and he only lasted for 6 months. So God says, look, I've blessed you like a little bit more. You've lasted longer than the others, but now that's it, chop. And Zechariah, his head rolled 6 months into his reign. And he was assassinated and succeeded by a bloke called Shallum. So Shallum then becomes King of Israel number 15. Now, on him, the Bible makes no comment whatsoever. On all the other kings, you at least get, even if, somewhere, you'll get that he did evil you'll get some comment that the scriptures make on their performance, be it good or bad, usually bad. Of Shallum, no comment is made whatsoever. We're simply told, all right, that he assassinated Zechariah, Jeroboam II's son, and that he became king for 6 months. And, sorry, not 6 months, he lasted for 1 month. So no comment is made on him. But the fact that he only reigned for 1 month before being assassinated himself probably is all the comment that you need. I mean, God's blessing was not on him. How can you say, king for a month and then assassinated? And he was assassinated by a bloke called Menahem, who became king himself. So number 16 now. He reigned for 10 years, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. At this point, Assyria was becoming a serious world power and made a play for Israel. But he was able to, sort of like to fend off that attack. And what he did, the leader of Assyria at that time was a bloke called King Paul. And what Menahem did, he paid him off. He just paid him loads of money and said, look, no, don't invade, have a load of treasure, all right? So he paid him off. And then after 10 years, he died a natural death and was succeeded by his son Pekahiah. Basically, because Menahem had Italian blood in him, Pekahiah was very short. And his dad keeps saying, Pekahiah, so he couldn't see anything. And anyway, so Pekahiah, it's bad, isn't it? Pekahiah, would you believe, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he lasted 2 years. And he was assassinated and succeeded as king by one of his officials who was called Pekah. So we get Pekahiah, and he was assassinated by one of his officials who was called Pekah, all right. And so Pekah now reigns for 20 years. Again, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it was during his reign that there was a partial invasion and occupation by Assyria. So now Assyria is becoming more and more powerful as a world power, and there is a partial invasion of Israel. Not complete, but Assyria now gain a foothold in Israel and therefore begin to have a bit of political and economic and military clout in the land. And that partial invasion and occupation occurred during the reign of Pekah. And then after 20 years, he was assassinated and succeeded by Israel's last king, who was called Hoshea. And Hoshea reigned for a further 9 years, and he was the last king of Israel. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And what happened is that by now Assyria's power has really become major, and Assyria is being led now by King Shalmaneser, a very well-known king to history. And so Hoshea becomes a vassal nation. He signs Israel over to being a vassal nation to the sovereignty of Assyria. But having done that, having become a vassal to Assyria and King Shalmaneser, what he then does is he double crosses Shalmaneser, and he then forms a treaty and an alliance with the king of Egypt. Now, Egypt and Assyria were not friends at that point. It was a stupid thing to have done, because Assyria was quite powerful enough to put paid not just to Israel but to Egypt as well. And so basically what happened is that at that Shalmaneser invaded. He sent the army in. He carted Hoshea and the vast majority of the Israelites in the north off to Assyria in captivity. And that was when the nation of Israel ceased to exist. The 10 tribes were taken off into captivity and were never heard of again. To this day, they have never been heard of again. They will be heard of again because in the Great Tribulation, the 144,000 Jews raised up to preach the gospel, there's 12,000 from every tribe. So the Lord knows where the 10 tribes are and who they are, as it were. But the point is, as a confederation, as the nation of Israel, they were carted off into captivity and they were destroyed completely. They were never heard of again. So now the northern kingdom, Israel, is no more. Now some Jews were left in Israel. Not many, but some. And the policy of the Assyrian nation at that time, when they invaded and took a country over, was to cart the people off into captivity and then repopulate the nation with their own people. So most of the Israelites were taken out, and loads of Assyrians moved in to occupy it and to live there. Now, the capital of the northern kingdom, as you'll remember, was Samaria. And this mixture of Assyrian and Jewish over the hundreds and hundreds of years that followed gave rise to a new kind of nation, in inverted commas, called the Samaritans. And that is why, in the time of Jesus, you'll find that the Jews were so snotty about the Samaritans, looked down their nose at them, wouldn't have anything to do with them, because they were half Jewish and half Assyrian. And so the Jews considered them to be a mixed race, a kind of a half caste. And whereas the Samaritans largely maintained the faith of Jehovah God, they largely maintained Judaism in its basic forms, many of the teachings that had come through the Old Testament and that Israel proper followed, the Samaritans didn't. And so therefore, the Jews proper looked down on them. And, so that's why the Samaritans, they were a Jewish half-caste, because they were half Jewish and half Assyrian. So then, what we've got here is that after the nation divides into Israel in the south and Israel in the north, Judah in the south, that Israel, after dividing off from the south, has 19 kings. Draw what significance you like from that, because as we're going to see, Judah had 19 kings as well, but I mean, I'm not going to try and make significance of it, so I don't know what the significance is. So they had 19 kings, and except for Jehu, who has the great honour of being referred to as someone who followed the Lord a little bit. Apart from Jehu, all of them were evil, and all of them were into idolatry, including Jehu. So there was one king in its whole history, one king who followed the Lord a bit, and it only was a bit because Jehu remained in idolatry, just like all the others did. And so you've got kings who were virtually the whole lot rotten, bad, evil. And there was no continuity either. There were 9 different family lines in those 19 kings. So there are 9 different dynasties, you know, because of all the assassinations. There were 7 assassinations and 1 suicide. You remember Zimri, when he knew he was beaten, went into the palace and burnt it down with him in it. And, you know, but he only did that because he knew he was going to be assassinated himself. So there were 7 actual assassinations and 1 suicide to prevent an 8th assassination. So a turbulent history, to say the least. And remember that it wasn't the Messianic line. And that was one of the reasons that it was such a mess. The Messianic line was continuing down in Judah. They were the breakaways. And can you see why the Lord, when Israel, all those hundreds of years earlier, started crying for a king? You see now why the Lord said, well, look, I shall think twice about this if I were you. You see? It wasn't because God was being a spoil sport. He knew what the people were asking for when they asked for a king. And so you can see the kind of trauma that people kept going through again and again and again. So, there you have it. That's the end of Israel. The northern kingdom has now gone. We have the 10 lost tribes. They've gone into Assyrian captivity, never to be heard of again. Boom, boom. We can now draw some comfort knowing that we're halfway through. And we now move on to the kings of Judah. So now, meanwhile, down in Judah, all right, let's go through there, through this lot, the kings of Judah. And you'll remember, number 1 was Rehoboam, Solomon's son. And you'll remember that he was the one, Jeroboam spoke to him on behalf of all the people and said, could we have a less kind of tight regime, you know, less kind of, you know, sort of like forceful and a little bit freer, blah, 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 blah. And you'll remember that Rehoboam, after consulting with his mates, said, well, look, my father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. So, absolute idiot. And of course, as a result of that, Jeroboam says, right, lads, we're off. And they down tools, as it were, and off they went to form the northern kingdom. So, you know, that's Rehoboam. He was an absolute idiot. But more important to the fact that he was an idiot, the Bible says of him, he did evil because he had not set his heart on seeking the Lord. And, you know, so boom, you know, God's judgment was on him. And at one point, he was attacked by Egypt under the kingship of a bloke called Shishak, Pharaoh Shishak. And they were losing. And he did a half-hearted act of repentance, you know, oh Lord help us, we're losing this battle. And so the Lord gave him victory. But having given him victory, what had been made of gold, because Shishak had kind of carted off loads of stuff from the temple and stuff like that, and everything that Shishak had nicked was all made of gold, because of course under the reign of Solomon, Israel was the richest nation there had ever been. But now, just one generation later, because the judgment of the Lord is on the nation, because they're not following him, now everything that had been nicked by Shishak that was gold, Rehoboam can only replace with bronze. Can you see what a come down economically? That's inflation for you. You know, when now bronze equals the value that gold used to. I mean, you know, God's judgment, and when God's judgment comes on, it's often an economic judgment as well. And the Bible recalls that the people were more faithful to the Lord than he was. So that's leadership you can well do without. And he reigned for 17 years, and he died, and he was succeeded by his son Abijah. And what we're going to see is that in Judah it was always succeeded by the son. All right, so this is one family all the way through. So Abijah, he reigned for 3 years. He was mostly bad. mostly bad. The Bible says of him, his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. So a bit of a Jehu here. A little bit devoted to the Lord, but not very much devoted to the Lord. And also he got into idolatry. And he kept going to war with Jeroboam up in the northern kingdom, so he wasn't a particularly peaceful bloke. And so not very successful. I mean, the curve is still going down. We've come from King David to Solomon, absolutely wonderful, fantastic. But then Solomon has fallen away, so the curve goes down. And Rehoboam was even worse than Solomon when Solomon was backslidden. And now Abijah is even worse. Can you see? So the curve is going down. The fall from grace nationally is happening. So Abijah dies, and he's succeeded by his son, who was called Asa. Asa had quite a good innings, 41 years he was king, and he started off well. The Bible says of him that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he was a good king. And he even deposed his grandmother because she was into idolatry and occultism. So I mean, the point is, different members of the royal family had positions in society. Today our Queen Mother has a real position, even though she's not actually the Queen, but by virtue of being the Queen Mother, you see. Now, he actually deposed his own grandmother from power precisely because she was an idolater. So that's commitment to the Lord. The Lord came before even his own family. But later on, he made an alliance with Aram, Syria, and he was rebuked by a prophet called Hanani. And he got angry because he'd been corrected, and he had Hanani imprisoned. And as soon as he did that, he fell away. And from that point onwards, he became an oppressive king. He oppressed the people. And so he started off well and then fell away. Shades of Solomon, it happens. But he died a natural death, and he was succeeded by his son, old Jehoshaphat. Good old Jehoshaphat again. We've done a Bible study on Jehoshaphat, so you know all about him. He reigned for 25 years, and he was a good king. Two quotes from the Bible: his heart was devoted to the ways of the Lord, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So that's great. He followed the Lord throughout, and he's most famous for the story about when Moab and Ammon invaded. And you'll remember he called the nation to fasting, and the prophet Jehaziel spoke the Lord's word. You know, the battle is mine and not yours. And you remember that when they went to the battle, he had the priests go out singing. So he had praises first, and and of course once they got there, God had already dealt with Ammon and Moab, and they were already destroyed and that. So that's the like the story that he's really famous for. And as we said a short while ago, he got into alliances with Ahab and Ahab's sons, Ahaziah and Joram. Each time he did it, he got told off. He got his knuckles rapped. God would send a prophet along and give him a going over for it, and but he didn't learn. He got rebuked for Ahab, and then he did Ahaziah. Then he got rebuked for Ahaziah, and then he did Joram. So he didn't. It's like Azariah. You'll remember we saw that as a result of the alliance with him, he built this commercial navy. This fleet of ships for trade, and that would have been an incredible economic adventure. Sort of really expensive. And the Lord sent a prophet along and rebuked him for it, and then the Lord sent a storm along and sunk all the ships. So I mean, this guy knew judgment in his life, but even though he was a bit thick there, we've all got areas of our lives were a bit thick, but nevertheless he followed the Lord, and he died a natural death, and he was succeeded by his son Jehoram. And Jehoram, he reigned for 8 years. Verdict on him: he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he was, he murdered his brothers. He was a real nasty piece of work. He murdered all his brothers because he didn't like competition, and he was into idolatry as well. And he married one of Ahab's daughters. So again, Jehoshaphat, can you see? Doubtless, I mean, he'd grown up seeing his dad doing all these stupid alliances, and now he goes and marries Ahab's daughter. So not good at all. And he was the one who received a letter from Elijah. And Elijah, he was a prophet up in the north. But he sent a letter down to the south, down to Judah, to King Jehoram, and told him that he was going to die of a lingering bowel disease because God's judgment was on him, which he duly did. And remember, we saw that the judgment on him is that he died to no one's regret. You know, there was no one who missed him. Everyone was happy that he was dead. It's not a very nice epitaph, but boom. Anyway, he was succeeded by his son Ahaziah, who lasted for 1 year, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Again, he was into idolatry, and he got embroiled with Joram up in Israel. Joram, again, Ahab's son. So now Jehoshaphat's grandson is getting into alliance with Ahab's descendants, and he did so at the time when Jehu was going about wiping out all Ahab's descendants. So he got embroiled with Joram in Israel, all right, King Joram in Israel, who was Ahab's son. Jehu was just being raised up a Lord to wipe out all Ahab's family, and old Ahaziah, because of his alliance with Joram, got caught up in it and he got killed as well. So the judgment wasn't actually being taken out on him, it was being taken out on Joram, but because he was in alliance with Joram, he copped it as well. So he died as a result of this alliance that he should never have been in, you know, with Joram up in the north. Anyway, now a slight hiccup, the one deviation from the Messianic line. Ahaziah's mum was called Athaliah, and she saw her chance with her son having been killed like that. She saw her chance, and so what she did, she killed the rest of her family. I mean, she was a right old witch. She killed the rest of her family to make sure there were no more successors, and she became queen in Israel. And she lasted for 6 years. And so now we have a monarch in Judah who was not in the Messianic line. Her husband had been, but she wasn't. She was only there by marriage, all right? However, Ahaziah had one son that she couldn't get to. He had a little boy called Joash. And the high priest at the time, a bloke called Jehoiada and his wife got Joash when they realised what Athaliah was up to. They got Joash and they hid him away. So there was one successor to the throne, all right? And what happened was that over the 6 years that Athaliah was the queen, Jehoiada worked on the army and worked on the people until he got them all on his side and behind Joash, who was the proper heir. And so once he did that, he had the army and the people on his side. Then they made Joash king, who should have been king all along. And Athaliah was executed because of her treason. So there you have the one hiccup, but the Messianic line was restored because now Joash becomes king, and Joash was Ahaziah's son. So the Messianic line, the descendants of David, is now back on course. And Joash actually reigned from age 7. So he was 1 when Athaliah tried to, killed all the family and tried to kill him. And for that 6 years he'd been, kept safe by Jehoiada and his wife. And so he reigned from the age of 7, and he lasted for 40 years. And he started off very good. The Bible says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And he had the temple repaired and restored, because very often the temple fell into neglect because no one cared because of the idolatry, blah, blah, blah. And he had all that done. And but then a bit daft Syria, which was then still known as Aram, invaded. And what he did is he bought them off. You could do that, he bought it, he said, don't invade me, I'll just give you all this money. But he could only raise the money by giving Aram all the treasure that he'd just put back in the temple. So he'd kind of just restored the temple back to its former glory. And then Aram invaded, so he quickly stripped the temple and gave it all to them. So all the bit, but I suppose that if you think that it's inevitable that you're going to get beaten, you might as well say, well, look, don't beat me up, just take me wallet. That was the idea. That was the idea. And so by and large he did well, but when Jehoiada died, the high priest, he started to backslide. Because Jehoiada had been like his father to him, all right? So he'd had a good upbringing, because Jehoiada was faithful to the Lord. But once Jehoiada died, he backslid and he got into idolatry. And Jehoiada's son was a bloke called Zechariah, and he was a prophet. And this prophet went to him, and said, look, you're backsliding, you're getting into idolatry. But he took no notice. And the people stoned Zechariah to death. And, Joash didn't do anything to protect him. And so at that point, his own officials murdered him to avenge the death of Jehoiada's son, Zechariah. So a very sad end there, sort of backslidden, and a very sad end. But he was succeeded by his son Amaziah. So the messianic line goes on okay. So Amaziah, he reigned for 29 years. He started off good. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but not wholeheartedly. And that was his downfall. He got into idolatry. And he challenged Jehoash, King Jehoash up in Judah, up in Israel. He challenged him to a fight. Jehoash didn't want to fight. Jehoash didn't want a civil war between the two nations, but Amaziah insisted, and it was disastrous. It went completely wrong, and Jehoash marmalised them, and he was taken prisoner. So although he was the king of Judah, now he ends up a prisoner up in Israel, but he was tracked down and then murdered by his own people. So they felt so betrayed that he should have led them in this idiotic war against the north when there was no reason for them to war. So his own people found where he was being kept prisoner, and they killed him. And so he was then succeeded by his son Azariah, also known as Uzziah. And this was when Isaiah came on the scene. Do you remember in the year that King Uzziah died? It's him, Azariah or Uzziah. He had both those names. He was called by either. And he reigned for 52 years. So he had quite a good innings. He started off good. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But when he got older, he grew proud. And what he did is he usurped the authority of the priesthood. And he determined to make sacrifices that only the priesthood could do. Because kings were kings and priests were priests. Remember, it was Jesus who was the great high priest and the king. And he preempted all that, and it was great arrogance. And so he made a sacrifice that only the priests should have done. And as soon as he did that, he was afflicted with leprosy. The Lord judged him on the spot, and he had leprosy until the day he died. And so his son succeeded him then. Not from the day he died, but from the day he got leprosy. So his son took over then, and his son was Jotam, and Jotam reigned for 16 years, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So he's a goodie. He was good. He rebuilt the upper gate of the temples, again, that had fallen down and stuff like that. So he worked on the temple to get a bit of the old restoration going. The only complaint that the Bible lays against him is that he didn't cleanse the land of idolatry. He himself wasn't an idolater. He was faithful, but he didn't clear. He should have cleared the land of it because he was king, but he didn't. But that was the only complaint that the Bible lays at his door. So a good one there, good old Jotam. Yes. Anyway, he had natural death, and he was succeeded by his son Ahaz. Now Ahaz, he reigned for 11 years. For 16 years. He was a stinker. And the Bible says of him that he provoked the Lord God of his fathers to anger. And not surprising, because he was the one who got into human sacrifice. And he sacrificed his own children. And so he was absolutely the pits. And he ended up in alliance with King Pekah of Israel. And then what he did after that is that he turned to Assyria, and he became a vassal nation of Assyria. So just at the time that Assyria is flexing its muscles ready to take over Israel, all right, Ahaz down in the south becomes a vassal nation to Assyria, and he virtually became Assyrian. He so completely went into Assyrian belief, culture and everything that it got to the point he nearly lost Judah, its Jewishness, completely. And sort of Judah was nearly wiped out, not by an invading army, but because its king totally endorsed the culture, beliefs and idolatry of the Assyrian nation. And so this was absolutely disastrous. And the guy who was the king of Assyria that he went into subservience to was a bloke called Tiglath-Pileser, again a very well-known king to history, and it was his successor, Shalmaneser, who took Israel into captivity just a few years later. So just at the point when the north was about to go under to Assyria, the south, of its own free will, goes into subservience and becomes a vassal nation of the Assyrians. And that was absolutely disastrous. And it was during the time, really around this time, that Israel, as I say, was swept away by the Assyrians. So now, as we continue with the history of Judah, we've now reached the point where Israel is gone. Because, of course, as you'll remember, the kingdom of Judah, being more faithful to the Lord than Israel had been, its eventual judgment came later, i.e. it lasted in the land an extra 100 years, all right? And it's at this point that Ahaz's son comes on the scene, King Hezekiah. And again, Hezekiah was a good king. He really did follow the Lord. And he reigned for 29 years. The Bible says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. And it was through Hezekiah, it was in his reign, that the influence that Assyria had on Judah was broken. Because Assyria, having casted off Israel in the north, was now poised perfectly to cart off Judah as well. So the Assyrian Empire was ready to come down, and when Hezekiah became king, as a result of what his father Ahaz had done, Judah was a vassal nation to the Assyrian Empire. So now the northern kingdom has gone, and the southern kingdom is poised to be subsumed by Assyria and carted off as well. But it was during the reign of Hezekiah that Assyria's power over Judah was broken, and the Lord delivered them. And Hezekiah was aided through the ministry of the prophet Isaiah. And you remember at one point Jerusalem was being sieged by the Assyrian army led by Sennacherib. And you'll remember that Sennacherib sent this letter, to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah went into the temple and he spread it out before the Lord. And what Isaiah said is that the Assyrian army was going to get called away, on some pretext, and as a result of that they would die, and overnight Jerusalem would go to virtually falling to Assyria to being free. And what happened was that the Assyrians had to temporarily withdraw from their siege because of an Egyptian incursion into their land somewhere else. So the Assyrian army are surrounding Jerusalem. Jerusalem is set to fall just as Samaria and Israel had done in the north, all right? But through the prophet Isaiah, Hezekiah, he's a believer, crying out to the Lord, and Isaiah says, don't worry, the Lord's going to set us free. And so what happens is that the king, Sennacherib, sends this letter to Hezekiah saying, look, we've got to go and sort, but I'll be back, and the siege will continue then. And you'll remember that what happened was that that night, as the Assyrian army marched away from Jerusalem, the angel of the Lord killed 185,000 of them. And Sennacherib was himself murdered by his two sons shortly after. So there, Judah was delivered from the oncoming, occupation by Assyria. And Hezekiah, he got the priesthood going again. He restored the temple, and he got the Passover going again. That he really restored Judah's religious life. So he really did, as it were, bring Judah back to the Lord. And you'll remember that he became ill and was going to die, and he sought the Lord to be healed. And you remember that the Lord said that he was going to heal him and give him 15 more years of life. And the sign given was, remember, the sundial went backwards. All right, the shadow on the sundial went backwards the wrong way. And it was during his last 15 years that he really goofed when the Babylonian envoys turned up, and he showed them all round his kingdom, which was a bit daft. And it was at that point that Isaiah prophesied that the Babylonian captivity would eventually happen. That Israel in the north had been taken away by Assyria and had been delivered from Assyria trying to take them away. But that later on the Babylonian Empire would take Judah into captivity. And what was so incredible is that at that point when Isaiah prophesied that during the reign of, here, that Babylon wasn't even a world power. It was just a tin pot little nation. And yet it was here that the prophecy goes out that the Babylonian captivity would take Judah off as well. And eventually Hezekiah, 15 years later, this extension to his life, he died, and he was succeeded by his son Manasseh. Now Manasseh reigned for 55 years, another stinker. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, idolatry, Baal worship, human sacrifice. So he took after not his father Hezekiah, but after his grandfather Ahaz. And so what happened in his reign is the Assyrians invaded, and there was a mini captivity. The Assyrians invaded and carted him and loads of the people off into captivity. But at that point, Menahem repented. He was being carted off into Assyrian captivity, and he repented. And although we don't know how it happened, as a result of him repenting, he was restored back down into Judah, and and so he ended up a good king. So and following the Lord. So he started off a real stinker, but ended up excellent. And he died, and he was succeeded by his son Amon. And Amon reigned for just 2 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, idolatry, etc., etc. Same old story. And he was actually assassinated by his own officials. Weren't a very nice bloke, they didn't like him, they assassinated him. But the people raised up against the officials and killed them. And so there was a bit of a skirmish and a little bit of a civil war there, but nevertheless the people made sure that he was succeeded by Josiah his son. So again, messianic line continuing nicely, no problems. So now we come to Josiah, and he reigned for 31 years, and like Hezekiah, absolutely excellent, absolutely ace. The Bible says of him, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and walked in the ways of his father David, not turning to the left or the right. And Hezekiah, what the Bible said about him, likened him to King David. So this really is the Bible saying him, Josiah, just like Hezekiah, absolutely wonderful. And Josiah was the best king since King David. I mean, he was the closest to King David out of all of them. And he restored the temple to its full former glory. Just as it had been in the early days of Solomon, he restored the temple to that again. And he totally removed idolatry and occultism from the land completely. And it was during his reign, while they were rebuilding the temple, you remember that the priests found the book of the law, because they'd lost the Bible. They'd lost it. I mean, they probably knew it existed somewhere, but they found a copy of it. And having found a copy of the Bible, the old, it would have been the books of Moses and perhaps some of the prophets as well. But having found that, he had the priests trained up so that they read it, knew it, understood it. He himself was instructed in it, and he sent priests out all over the land as Bible teachers to teach the people the ways of God, and also he brought the Passover back as well. How rarely the Passover, which was supposed to be celebrated every year of Israel's history, if you go through the Bible, it was only ever celebrated a handful of times up to this point. Unbelievable. Well, he restored the Passover as well. Now, there was a slight hiccup right at the end of his reign. I mean, it doesn't detract from the marvellous things the Bible says about him, but he did do a bit of a silly thing at towards the end of his life. Well, towards the end of life, it was what killed him, because he challenged Pharaoh Necho to a fight. Now, Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt. Now, the Lord told him not to, but he did anyway. The Bible don't tell us why, but he decided he wanted to war with Egypt, and so he did. And but the Lord said no, but he did it anyway. And as a result of it, Judah was beaten by the Egyptians and became a vassal nation of Egypt. Egypt had taken over from Assyria as the world power. And now Judah has gone and got itself vassalized, if there's such a word, but a vassal nation to the Egyptians. And Josiah died in the battle that happened as a result of that. So a bit unfortunate that. And he was then succeeded by his son Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz lasted for 3 months. The Bible says of him, he did evil in the sight of the Lord just as his fathers had done. He was an idolater. Bad news all round. Pharaoh Necho didn't like him and carted him off into captivity, so he went into Egyptian captivity. And when Necho did that, he put his brother Eliakim on the throne in his place. So still Messianic line because it was his brother. And but when Necho put Eliakim on the throne, he changed his name. And he changed his name to Jehoiakim, it being a sign of that I'm in authority over you. But nevertheless, Jehoiakim is still the Messianic line because he was the brother, all right. And Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It was during his reign that Babylon beat Egypt, and now Babylon became the world power instead of Egypt, all right. So Judah has been a vassal at this point to Egypt. Babylon takes Egypt over. So Judah's vassal status now passes to Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire was led by Nebuchadnezzar. So now Judah becomes a vassal nation to Nebuchadnezzar. Now Jehoiakim, 3 years later, having passed into vassal status under Nebuchadnezzar, rebels against Babylon. A bit of a daft thing to do, but he rebelled against Babylon. He declared UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence. Well, Nebuchadnezzar didn't put up anything like that, so Jerusalem was sieged, and it was at that point that Nebuchadnezzar plundered the temple, destroyed the temple. And as a result of that, Jehoiakim was carted off in chains to Babylon and died there. And he was succeeded by his son Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim, he lasted, the Bible was very specific about this, he lasted 3 months and 10 days. But then he was only 18, so perhaps that's why. He wasn't very clever, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And again, he chanced his arm with Nebuchadnezzar, and I mean, you don't do things like that. So he was carried off to Babylon with all but the poorest in the land. So now the captivity proper, the first phase of it is starting to happen. So he's casted off, and his uncle Mattaniah. So still the Messianic line because he was King Josiah's brother, but his uncle Mattaniah is made king in his place by Nebuchadnezzar, and but Nebuchadnezzar changes his name to Zedekiah. All right. So this Zedekiah, all right, was Josiah's brother. All right, sorry, Josiah's son, and so it's still the Messianic line. Okay, and so now Zedekiah. Jehoiakim's uncle is reigning, and he lasted for 11 years. He was the last king of Judah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it was at this point that Jeremiah was raised up. And Jeremiah's ministry, as we see when we get to him, was basically say, look, surrender to the Babylonian captivity. Don't fight it. It's God's will. And of course that he was called a traitor, wasn't he? Because all the false prophets were saying, no, the Lord's going to give us deliverance. But the Lord wasn't, because it was judgment. So Jeremiah's ministry said, look, surrender to this because it will be easier on you. But they didn't. They fought against it, and so they were virtually wiped out completely. And so Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, again utter stupidity, and it was that rebellion 11 years into his reign that brought on the full and final captivity. Nebuchadnezzar sent all his forces in, carte blanche. They destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, and the temple and all the important buildings were burned. The palace, the temple, all set on fire. Basically Jerusalem was razed to the ground, and everyone who was left was carted off into captivity. And Zedekiah himself was carted off to Babylon with his eyes gouged out. And he was the last king of Judah. And so there we have the Babylonian captivity of Judah. 100 years after the north was taken into captivity by Assyria, the south is now taken into captivity by Babylon. The date 600 BC or thereabouts. Now Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by a bloke called Evil-Merodach. That was his successor. And Evil-Merodach struck up a relationship with Jehoiakim and set him free. Jehoiakim, you remember, he had been king but carted off by Nebuchadnezzar. Evil-Merodach set him free and let him live out his days in the palace. So can you see the Davidic, the Messianic line is thereby preserved? You see, Jehoiakim was set free. So one of the people in the Messianic line, the descendants of David, has been spared. So there's basically, you know, the history of the kings of Judah, and that as opposed to what we saw in Israel, when there were no less than 9 family lines, here we just have one family. All right, there was the slight discontinuity with Queen Athaliah, but that was all set right, no problem. There was absolutely, you know, there was no discontinuity. The next king was the one who should have been, and so one family, but there were 19 kings. So after the division of the kingdom, Judah had 19 kings, the same as Israel did. Now of Judah's lot, 10 were wholly evil and into idolatry. You'll remember with Israel, all of them were evil, but there was just one, Jehu, who was like a little bit, just a little bit all right. Now, down in Judah, 10 were wholly evil and into idolatry. One, Manasseh, you'll remember, went from being evil to following the Lord. I.e., he was a pagan and then became a believer at the end and was faithful to the Lord. 4 started off following the Lord but fell away and became evil and got into idolatry. 2 were very good, that's Jehoshaphat and Jotam. And 2 were absolutely fantastic, Hezekiah and Josiah. And they were likened to King David, so absolutely excellent. So and there were 4 assassinations, as opposed to the, you know, there were quite a few more up in Israel. So a mess, but a better mess, because at least it was the Messianic line. It wasn't at least a breakaway. So there we leave it, all right. We've now got the 10 tribes, the North Israel, gone for good, all right. I mean, there'll be no more appearances from them until the Great Tribulation and the Millennium. They are gone for good. They're off the sea, as far as we're concerned. Whereas Judah, we've seen them, they're now off the scene, 600 BC. They're kind of gone into captivity through the Babylons. But what we move on to next time, the next 3 books that we look at, is the story of how 70 years later Judah was restored back into the land. Whereas Israel was never heard of again, Judah was. It came back, and then Judah started being called Israel. So Judah was eventually restored, and we'll be looking at how that happened. And it's important to have this firmly in your mind, all that we've done tonight, for a simple reason, that when we come on after, you know, sort of like, you know, we do the wisdom books, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, blah, 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 then we come on to the prophets. And the only way that we're going to understand the prophets is to realise that most of them, though not all of them, some of them fit in the history that we're going to be starting to look at next time. But most of them fit in the time scale of the kings of either Israel or Judah. That's why we need to understand this time frame. And we're only going to understand what each prophet was about as we understand the history and, you know, which king he was speaking to, and you see whether he was north, south or whatever. So what you've got to picture it is this, the talk we've done tonight, which kind of consolidates all, you know, the talks we've done on Kings and Chronicles, all right? What you've got to think of it, having that, you know, got the kings of Israel and Judah, think of that as being the backbone, the spine. Now, when we come to do the prophets are the ribs of the rib cage, but they all fit at different points down the spine, as a rib cage does. So therefore, it's only by having this history fairly clear in our minds, along with the history of the restoration back into the land, which we'll start to look at next time. It's only as we've got that history that the message of the prophets that we'll then move on to at a later date after all the wisdom stuff, it's only then that those books are going to make any sense to us at all, by seeing where in the history they fit in, or which rib are they fitting where into the actual backbone. So there you are, a riveting study. I know that you loved it, every word of it, and I shall finish now, and I shall come and wake you all up, and we'll have a nice cup of coffee. So I'll finish it there.